The Quran says, in no unclear terms, if you fear nushuz from your wife, you can beat her. Please scratch out chapter 4, verse 34 from the Quran.
Moving on to the most controversial part, the most controversial of the controversial, and I know I've repeated that many times, but this really is the most controversial part, the strike them part. Professor Hussain writes, quote, the final punitive step in Quran verse 434, namely the instruction to strike the wife, is only to be carried out on the basis of 4 witnesses to her adultery, unquote. Strike them refers to the lashes meted out to convicted adulterers, male or female. He writes further, quote, as for the change in verb between Quran 4 and Quran 24 from daraba to strike to jalada or to lash, we should note that the Quran often uses several terms for the same legal issue. In fact, the earliest lexicons define jald or lashing as a type of darb or strike, unquote. Actually, the Quran, quote, leaves the punishment vague. Verse 416 simply says, hurt them both, and verse 34 has strike them. I suggest that both verses are then qualified by verse 24:2, which clarifies that the striking or hurting is by means of 100 lashes, unquote. Professor Hussain writes further, quote, if a husband is permitted to hit his wife on mere suspicion of adultery in Quran 4, that is 434, then why would he need to provide 4 witnesses before she faces corporal punishment in Quran Surah 24, verses 2 to 6? He writes further, quote, Quran Surah 24 clarifies that 4 witnesses are required, which further suggests that this is a judicially executed punishment. If, however, the husband is the sole witness to his wife's unfaithfulness, then the only option available to him are the mutual cursing laws in Surah 24, verses 6 through 9, unquote. So, the algorithm that Professor Hussain uses is as follows. He says, number 1, if the husband suspects his wife of nushuz, he warns her. If the husband's evidence for his wife's nushuz increases, perhaps on account of her being alone with another man, then he abandons the marital bed. If, however, the husband's evidence for his wife's nushuz increases further, in this case, if there are 4 witnesses to her adultery, then she is beaten, she is lashed by the judicial authority, as stated in verse 24:2, following which she may not marry a believer, verse 24:3. If, however, the husband is the only witness, as mentioned in verse 24:6, then the cursing laws are applied, verses 24:6 through 9, which entails a curse from God upon the liar, but does not entail any judicial corporal punishment. The fact that these cursing laws exist means that the husband cannot just arbitrarily strike his wife on mere suspicion of sexual infidelity. How could that be the case when, even if the husband is positive that he saw sexual infidelity, the Quran is still disallowing him to enforce the punishment unless he has those 4 witnesses? Professor Hussain writes, there is a hadith cluster that lends support to the argument that husbands are not the addressees in Quran verse 434. For example, he cites the following hadith: Umar ibn al-Khattab took a Nashiz woman and admonished her, and then separated them. The final step of lashing was not taken, likely due to the lack of evidence. However, this shows that the authority in control was actually the caliph. Now, again, we don't need to take these reports as historical necessarily to use them. However, Professor Hussain says that even on the principle of dissimilarity, we could say that these are fairly early reports. Finally, Professor Hussain brings to bear his profound and deep knowledge of the Jewish tradition in order to understand a similar situation in Jewish law and in the Bible, which will help us to understand the Quran more. And this is part of the knowledge that historical critical scholars bring to bear on the text that our medieval exegetes were not that strong in, and so this is something that we can benefit from modern scholarship. Professor Hussain is referring to Numbers 5, verses 11 through 31, which are talking about a woman who strays and is going towards marital infidelity. Professor Hussain writes, quote, the Talmud describes such a woman as a sota, literally one going astray, unquote. He writes further, quote, these laws were expanded in the Mishnah. The husband must first warn his wife not to associate with the man whom he suspects her of having an illicit relationship with. So the first step is the same that we saw in the Quran, which is admonishment. If she continues to associate with him, then her husband must abandon sexual relations with her. Now we see that the second step is exactly the same as well. It's refraining from the marital bed. If the husband desires to take matters further, he can then take her to the court to face the so-called ordeal of the bitter waters as described in Numbers 5, unquote. He goes on to write that the parallels with Quran verse 434 are remarkable. The first two steps that the suspicious husband is to take perfectly align with the Mishnah's procedure for the sota, or the straying wife. In fact, the third part is also analogous because in the third part, the woman is brought to the court or the judiciary in order for a ruling to be made. But in that case, evidence must be brought in order to enact the ruling and the judgment against her. So first there's a warning, second there's a separation, and third you go to the court for a trial, which can involve oaths being taken both in the Jewish and biblical example as well as in the Quran. Now, Professor Hussein notices one significant difference between the case of the Quran and the Bible in Jewish law. The Quran makes the husband also take on oaths and the possibility of a curse of God falling down on him if he's lying, which the Bible does not do. So in the Bible, it's only the wife who has to go through the ordeal, but in the case of the Quran, the husband does too. This is moving towards greater gender equity. As Professor Hussein writes, quote, the Quran is building on Jewish law in a way that encompasses greater gender equity. See, for example, the Quran's introduction of the possibility of husbandly nushuz above. As we said previously, it had been the case that only women could be accused of nushuz, but according to the Quran, the husband can also be guilty of this. And this is a move towards gender equality or equity. So the Quran is moving towards greater gender equity in that both the husband and wife accepted God's curse on themselves if they are being dishonest, unquote. And finally, both the husband and the wife face the same punishment if they are found guilty. Any man and any woman found guilty of zina or fornication and adultery will suffer the same punishment. In summation, the Quran is moving towards greater gender equity. This passage has nothing to do with wife beating. Instead, it's talking about what to do in case the husband fears sexual infidelity. In that case, he has two options. One, he can admonish her. That's the first step. If he has more evidence than that, then he can separate from the marital bed. That will force her to give up her ways or be exposed in case she gets pregnant. And finally, if he has enough evidence and proof, if he has 4 witnesses, then he can go to the court, accuse his wife, and she then stands trial. If he doesn't have those witnesses, then it's mutual cursing and mutual oath-taking, in which case the husband's oaths will be neutralized if the wife also takes on oaths. So in that case, without witnesses, if the wife says that she's not being sexually infidelitous, then in that case, the wife actually wins the case because the judgment is not passed against her. We should note here that this interpretation is, of course, at odds with the medieval exegetes and what has been understood in the classical tradition for a long time. But that's not a reason to reject this interpretation. Historical critical scholars have long recognized a disjunction or a disjuncture between the Quran as it existed in its initial milieu and as it was understood by its initial audience and the medieval exegetes or the Islamic tradition itself. So this is not something unusual. In fact, the misinterpretation of the medieval exegetes and the Islamic tradition in general actually stands as proof that we need to revisit the Quran and understand the Quran on its own terms, which is something that is being done now, not just by Muslim reformists and modernists, but also by many Reformed traditionalists who are also going down what can be called the Quranic turn. The bottom line is that this Quranic passage has nothing to do with wife beating and has been terribly misunderstood by the tradition. Now, having said all of that, I do want to clarify that the Islamic tradition itself, even though it initially misunderstood this passage, nonetheless tried to mitigate the effects of this passage. So it's not the case that the Islamic tradition freely endorsed wife beating. No, there was always a trend that did kind of go in this authoritarian kind of direction, but there was also a mitigating part of the tradition which tried to mitigate the harms to the wife. And that's why there are narrations that are attributed to companions that say that only beat the wife lightly, and even to the point of beating her with a toothstick or feather, whatever you want to call it. Now, many Islamophobes laugh about this, and maybe there is something humorous about it. But in reality, what they're trying to do is neutralize the text without going away from the tradition itself. And so this is actually a highly nuanced and sophisticated way that a traditionalist can move away from the explicit meaning of the text as understood by them. Now, as we've seen, they've actually misunderstood the text. So they didn't really need to go down this path. But we should give credit where credit is due. Conservative traditionalists don't necessarily endorse wife beating. In fact, they try to mitigate it and try to move away from it, such to the point that even they attributed a hadith to the Prophet in which he said that I wanted something else when this passage was revealed. And then there's other reports attributed to the Prophet in which he says that he never touched his wives, never hit his wives, and that the best of you are those of you who do that are not the best of you. So there were all sorts of other texts that were used in order to soften the blow of this passage, even when it was misunderstood. Let's read that entire passage now, verse 434 of the Quran. Men are the financial maintainers of women, through God having favored one over the other. How did he favor men over women? That is, they have more wealth in general, and they get double the inheritance. Why? Because they need to spend from their wealth on their wives. And that's why the rest of the passage, or the next part of the passage, says, and through their spending from their wealth. Therefore, righteous women are obedient. And we saw in the last video that it means obedience to God, not obedience to the husband. Guarding in their husband's absence, that is when their husband is off for trade or for war, because God has guarded them. That is, in marriage. As for those whose sexual infidelity you fear, admonish them and leave them in their beds. And that's why this passage says leaving them in their beds. That's how we know it's linked to sexual infidelity. And if you have enough proof, then you can go to the court and you can seek a judgment against your wife. That is, if you have 4 witnesses. If a judgment is passed against her, then the court will issue that judgment, which is lashes or strikes. And so then the woman is struck. And that's where it says, and strike them. But the verse goes on. Then if they obey you, that is, they refrain from sexual infidelity, seek not a way against them. That is to say, if they refrain from sexual infidelity after you admonish them, or after you leave them in their beds, or perhaps after the judgment is issued against them, in either of these cases, if they refrain from their sexual infidelity after you take these measures, then seek not a way against them. That is, you're not allowed to harm them. So this passage, far from advocating wife beating for any and all purposes, doesn't allow wife beating at all. In fact, it doesn't allow you to strike a woman unless you have a judgment issued against her, and even then it's only for sexual infidelity. So in any other case, you're not allowed to hit your wife. Seek not a way against them. Truly, God is exalted great. Bottom line is that the Islamic tradition is highly nuanced. The Quranic text needs to be understood in its original context, and this trope that is used by Islamophobes should now finally go to the wayside. Thank you so much to Professor Hussein for writing this excellent article. I really hope that the audience will go and download and read that article. And please make sure to like, subscribe, and share so that we can grow this channel. Thank you so much, and see you next time.